Hallo und herzlich willkommen zurück zu einer weiteren Folge Witch on the Holy Night. Sojiro wurde jetzt eingeholt von Aoko, beziehungsweise hat mehr oder weniger aufgegeben die Flucht. Und irgendwie ist da noch eine Kreatur, Ding, Mädchen, Wesen, keine Ahnung, hat den Park auch noch betreten, und wird wahrscheinlich noch dazwischen funken, zwischen dem, was da jetzt passiert. Ist Eisbein im Bewilderment. Not that she had mentioned it. He realized that would have been the obvious question to ask. He had more or less picked up on the fact that he was being killed for learning some secret, but it was human nature to want to know more.
そっか。それはそうなるな。
A simple affirmation. His face was a mixture of resignation and forlorn longing. He thought for a moment before.
でも言う必要はない。聞きたくないんだ。
He responded in a major subdued voice. His response was clear, rather gallantly so.
そう。じゃ、殺すけど。死ぬの怖くないの？
怖いに決まってる。何より痛そうだ。
His face turned right as he objected, to which Aoko frowned. Nonchalant as he could be, he was honest about his feelings.
そりゃ怖いでしょ。私だって怖いと思うし。でも悪いわね。我慢して。人でなしと罵ってくれて結構よ。今の私は本当にその通りだから。そういった意味じゃあんたと同じ。普通の道徳がないのよ。だから必要なら人も殺せる。
Sojiro's finger twitched in response to her indifferent tone, as if to say that despite having given up on just about everything, his body could not let those words slide.
人殺しなんて良くないぞ。
分かってるって言ってるでしょ。
Aoko raised her right hand. The light from the crest illuminated her face. Oh, warte mal, da sehe ich doch was. Ist das jetzt Aoko oder? Ah ja, doch ist Aoko. Ich habe gerade das hier kurz für ein Lächeln gehalten, deshalb. It goes without saying that her expression was unchanged. She was not crying, nor was she smiling. She was a young woman who had excised her feelings. Deal with it was another thing Sojiro could not let slide. Sojiro could read on Aoko's face that she was not herself. She was in pain, and to a degree he had never seen in her.
すまない。ちょっといいかな。
何？ここまで悲壮感を盛り上げておいて、やっぱり逃げるなんてのは却下よ。
He unconsciously smiled at Aoko's ruthless counter and breathed a sigh of relief. He had misread the pain he saw in her face. This was the same Aoko. Sojiro laughed out loud in genuine joy, a laugh that most other people would have taken as an insult.
遺言でも聞いてあげようと思った私が甘かった。っていうか、今の小バカにした笑いがあんたの遺言ってことで OK？
いや、そうじゃなくて、あそこにいる人は青崎の友人なのか？
Out of nowhere, Sojiro pointed behind Aoko.
はあ？
Aoko thought that it must have been that old overused distraction technique. If this had been a Japanese comedy act, this would be the part where she gave him a whack with a paper fan. But after giving it a second thought, she realized Sojiro didn't have the capacity for understanding old or even new tricks.
あんた、何言って。
Perhaps his honest disposition had been to his benefit. Without thinking, Aoko gave in to her curiosity and turned her gaze towards the direction in which his finger was pointed. And there, something that should not have been there in the maze, a creaking wooden smile. It was the ominous, creepy, uncanny figure of a girl.
人形?
An unusual figure with 2 arms and 2 legs stood silently in the darkness. If only for a moment, its beauty, which was even apparent from afar, died the insanity of the current situation. Okay, das ist sick. Extend. The utterly unknown threat made Aoko freeze on the spot. Avoiding it didn't even occur to her. Humans possessed intelligence and knowledge, but when confronted with the unknown, they failed to process what to do and... A shriek escaped Aoko's mouth. The magical attack crossed into the 30-foot gap in an instant. The armor of the girl who had appeared at the rear of the corridor was slender and quick. It extended to a near impossible length, striking Aoko from behind. Aoko crashed into the wall as she fought back an angry whimper. The attacker retracted his arm. Sojiro sprang to his feet. He darted to her side and used all the strength he could muster to get her to her feet. He could not believe how light she was. In Sojiro's mind, Aoko was an extraordinary individual. He had expected that if he were to ever touch her, it would be apparent she was far stronger than he. But in reality, she felt about as heavy as you would expect a 100-pound girl to feel. Meanwhile, that thing continued to wheel its arm as if it were some sort of mechanism. Das sieht mir sehr Ghost in the Shell mäßig aus, finde ich. Having extended more than 30 feet from the elbow joint, it clanked as it turned to its previous shape and size.
大丈夫か？
やめてよ。わからないわ。なんでそんな顔できるの？
Aoko tore her hand away from Sojiro. Suddenly she felt her knees buckle from under her, but Sojiro caught her before she could hit the ground and helped her to her feet.
無理するな。で、あいつは知り合いか？
He looked back at the eerie shadow 30 feet away as it finished retracting its arm.
そうね。似たようなやつとは命をせめぎ合ったのかよ。
Aoko grabbed her lower back as she answered. A searing pain shot through her.
でも、痛いっちゃ痛いけど、僕だけ？あれだけ絶好の奇襲をしておいて。それとも、この距離じゃ当たっても致命傷にならない？なんて、あるわけないか。
Aoko tried to stay her breath as she assessed the damage done to her back. The pain was quick to fade and her breathing returned to normal. For the time being, her motor functions were no longer hindered, which meant the real damage was elsewhere.
青崎、あれ。
分かってるわ。黙ってて。
Blue light glowed across the gloom. The magic energy generated by her breathing was accumulating in her right arm. If magic energy was in the fuel, the formula was ignited. For Aoko, this was little more than a reenactment of 2 evenings ago. Next time the puppet extended its arm, Aoko would fire a magic bullet as fast as she could. A battle at approximately 30 feet. As long as Aoko could secure a 2-second window, she could create a counter-attack to end the duel. It made its move. With its head tilted down, there was no expression to be seen, and in the darkness it appeared its apparent age was impossible to make out. To the two humans, the puppet was not dissimilar to a faceless ghost. Its left arm slowly came up with a grinding sound. Its movements were dull, as if the joints were rusty. The right arm, which had been extended earlier, hung at its side. Though the puppet's mouth was hidden by its long locks, the sense was that it was smiling.
さっきと用途が違う。あれが本命。Cedric君、どいて。
She threw herself into Sojiro and extended her hand, its arm extended at that very moment. The timing was impeccable. In a single second, Aoko's snap bullet scored a hit directed on the puppet's arm, throwing off its trajectory and sending it crashing into the puppet's body with a violent explosion. Or at least that is what would have happened had the magic formula been invoked. She barely avoided being struck once again. When her magecraft failed, her intuition took over and she just managed to get away.
やられた。最初のはそういうことか。
She clenched her teeth in frustration, her thoughts racing a mile a minute. Fight or flight. and only had one arm left, which would take time to retract. This was the best shot Aoko had at defeating it. If she could evade the right arm just a fraction, she could get close enough to...
Insum, solitare pluturesque inferis. Ictius meus obitus dies, et meus nativus dies, Theobeam.
In slumber I live in dirt, I rot alone. Today is the day I died and was born, I come to you. A crackle echoed through the corridor. The poetic murmurs contained enough magical energy for a mage to perceive. The verse itself was Latin, but it contained hints of the language of curses, Ganda. Originally they were words meant to curse or a hated adversary. However,
Mea animae mortalis, otem eftura negata sunt. Manes sum, animam definire ambiguum est. Theodi et te amo, conveniamus insomnio ipso.
the puppet was directing the words at itself. Curses backed curses. The victims called down a curse on the assailant, creating a vicious circle of negativity. The incantation was meant to do just that. However, this was ultimately a one-puppet show. An unprecedented source of power akin to auto-intoxication. As unbelievable as it seemed, the cycle of curses had been turned into a perpetual moving device.
何それレベル高すぎじゃない
Aoko abandoned the idea of digging her heels. It was time to flee with all due haste.
何してんのあんたも来る
She grabbed Sojuro's hand and ran as fast as she could deeper in the realm of mirrors. The crackling voice continued its murmuring behind them.
Proximi mich negligentes ferunt. Omnes nos peccantes fuimus. Et omnes nos edem fuimus. Omnes nos peccatores sumus. Venit domum meum. Lut simile somnium. Et pulvere simile quotidianum. Corruprebo. Te judico.
Okay. Ist ja mal Spaß. Aoko fought against the pain in her back as she ran through the mirrored corridor. She dragged Sojuro by the hand.
青崎、傷は
別に背骨がしびれてる程度よ内臓は平気だし
She cursed inwardly at how much of a mess she felt though. Unlike Sojuro, Aoko did not run into any transparent walls. Thanks not to the superior sight, but rather preparation, she had hammered the layout of the building into a memory.
平気ってわかるのか
そりゃ自分の体だもの身体管理は基礎中の基礎よ
Ako's matter-of-fact answer contrasted with Sojuro's nervous questioning. The corridor grew shorter with each and every left turn. At first they were able to advance in a straight line for about 100 feet at a time. But by now they were forced to turn a corner every 50 feet or so.
あいつはあの夜の
多分ね同じタイプだと思う貴重なオートマタを惜しげもなく使い捨てるなんてよっぽどお金持ちなんだろうけど
Sojuro furrowed his brows. He was grateful that she was answering his questions, but baffled by the strange words she was using.
青崎ストップもう随分走ったぞあいつは曲がり角一つ分向こうだ少し休もう
His words suggested that he was still concerned about her injuries. Aoko shook her head in irritation.
あの距離を狙ってくる相手に通路一つ分のリードは無意味よせめて二つ分に行くまで走るの
Sojuro nodded. With that matter settled, she
な
asked,
んで俺を連れて行ってるんだ
逃げられたくないからじゃないバカ
Answering curtly, Aoko glared at her naive prey. The two of them headed for the next corner. Their legs began to slow as they rounded one more. Aoko rubbed her back as she tried to catch her breath. Though Aoko had insisted that she was fine, it appeared to have been bravado. Even the usual clueless Sojuro felt the desperation they were in. He stood behind Aoko with his arms folded. While they had a moment, he tried to make sense of everything. First, Aoko had nearly killed him. Though he was saved at the last possible second, it was by the strange, stretchy woman Aoko had burned to ashes 2 nights prior. He could barely make it out that night, but he considered it her. because it looked female. The woman's attack wounded Aoko's back and forced her to flee. Aoko had taken Sojo with her, claiming that the reason she did so was to prevent her prey from escaping. In other words,
青崎はまだ諦めてないんだな。
当たり前よ。あんなやつ、仮に2体と半分始末しても、あんた用の余力は残せるわ。
her tone was sharp, but even Sojo could see that she was struggling to stay confident. The damage to her body was too much to afford her any optimism. Still, the fury in her eyes refused to accept the circumstances.
中がところどころショートしてる。あの右腕は回路を混戦させるジャミングってわけね。
Though the proper response would have been for her to tremble in fear, she did nothing but shake her fists in anger. The disruption of formulae was only supposed to work on absolute beginners. If it had been her roommate, the arm would have been repaired the instant it hit her, and the attacker's circuits burned out rather than her own. Attempting to establish a link to magic circuits of another mage was like presenting your heart on a silver platter. It would be of no use in a battle against a superior mage. And yet her adversary had been designed to do just that. Coupled with the attacks on areas of Misaki under Aoko's jurisdiction these last few weeks, it was a clear statement from the enemy, who had revealed itself as a fellow mage 2 days ago. In other words, the puppet saw Aoko as no threat at all.
敵ながら正確な判断だこと。
While she was still angry, the whirlwind of emotions within her started to fade. Her face was that of a hunter far beyond her years.
なんか俺の時より真剣だな。
まあね、あんたの時は遊びが入ってたし。
Soju was not sure whether to be happy or sad at that.
わからないことだらけで何を聞いていいかわからないんだけど。
Aoko didn't respond. Her eyes were focused on the darkness before them. The silence was heavy and the darkness was like a nose closing in on them. But Soju continued in spite of her indifference.
青崎はあいつも殺すのか。
A stillness fell over them. It was as if the gloom was pulling them in. No response. Their breathing was the only sound echoing in the dim corridor. There stood Soju, forcing her to confront her sins, and the magician girl who continued to ignore him. They spent a few seconds seemingly frozen in time.
それがあなたのキーワードみたいね。
Aoko whispered in a lifeless tone. Her sight was tinged with both resignation and contempt.
何？
独り言よ。それと言っとくけど、あいつは人間じゃないわ。信じられないだろうけど、自分の意志で動く人形なの。この前のも、今のやつもね。
Soju nodded as he processed the information. Not only did he not doubt her story, but he seemed to have accepted it at face value.
なんか落ち着いてるわね、あなた。
まさかもう何が何だかわからないからあまり考えないことにしてるだけだ。ただ人形に関しては別にどうということはない。
もしかして他でも自動人形を見たことあるとか？
ん？都会の人形ってああいうものじゃないのか？
ね。
She barely stopped herself from falling to her knees. Of course he couldn't. How could she have forgotten? She was dealing with a bona fide, natural-born moron. As a student who transferred from the isolation of the mountains like an endangered species, his utter lack of common sense rendered anything miraculous as mundane. If automobiles were moving hunks of metal, then moving puppets were nothing to write home about. Wait, that meant, to him, the incident from the other night hadn't been extraordinary at all. He might have even assumed it was an everyday occurrence in the city.
参った。いっぺん頭の中覗いてみたいっていうか、ほんと、ここまで来ると感心するわ。調子が狂うのも当然だった。普通は私に襲われた時点でもっと違う反応をするはずなのに。化け物とか、お化けとかさ。でもあなたにとっては、そういうこともあるで済まされてたわけなんだ。なんかバカみたいね。 私。
Her strained face returned to normal for a moment. It hit her. There had been another way to handle this without anyone getting hurt, but the damage had already been done. There were no do-overs in life, nor should there be. Her own mistaken assumptions had sent that situation spiraling out of control. But now that Tsuchi was involved, she had to make sure that her secret was safe with him. Even if there had been another, better option, that ship had sailed. Human relationships were ultimately driven by mutual misunderstandings. They were like tapestries, woven from mismatched intentions. Break time was over. There stood Aoko, Aosaki, and Sojiro Shizuki. The first ever idle conversation had come to an end, not that they had a choice in the matter. It was the jamming, murmuring form around the corner that cut it short.
Nemo mev nus memnit, vidroit extinct sest. Initio eraberamos dom rebimus dolores sunt. Nemo adiuvat.
The enemy was just around the corner, visible in the mirrors parallel to it.
悠長に話してる場合じゃないわね。
In contrast to Aoko's elegant blues, its lights were a malicious red.
感動打ち。
There was a momentary flash of light before she even extended her arm. But the instant she saw the enemy, her dormant feeling erupted once more.
さっきから邪魔なのよ。
She channeled all of her pent-up anger and shunted it into her right arm. The fog that filled the corridor was no magical waving, but rather a barrier of raw energy. It was equivalent of setting ablaze 3 buckets of gasoline to create a wall of fire, in the hope it would stop an arrow in flight. If the puppet had attacked with its arm, it could have pierced such a wall easily, but because it had loose cursors with no definite form, the wall of energy repelled the attack. While it was a huge waste of magic energy, it was the only means Aoko had to protect herself at that very moment. Unfortunately, its protection was reserved for Aoko alone. Cedric held his hand to his mouth. While the curse had been weakened to the point where Aoko could no longer feel it, it had plenty of effect on Sojiro, who was not a mage. As if it understood the fact, the puppet turned its gaze from Aoko to the unanticipated human behind her.
こいつは関係ないでしょ。
Enraged, she swung her arm forward, once again. The blue light formed a wall to block the gunner for a scant few seconds. It was enough of an opening to exploit. Just as Aoko was forming the wall, the puppet pointed its right arm at her face and before the rocket of death could be fired, Cedric and scooped her up into his arm. How he mustered the strength to do so was a mystery, but he turned his back on the puppet and took off running. He was a nimble sprinter, resembling a deer leaping across obstacles. Cedric rounded 2 more corners, ignored whatever complaints Aoko was making, and eventually stopped in the middle of the 2nd floor. He set her down.
よし、ここまで来れば少しは休めるな。
Cedric's shoulders heaved as he caught his breath. As led as she was, running while carrying someone else would make anyone winded. She looked up at him in incomprehension.
こんな体力あったのに、なんで？
It made no sense to her. If he had the stamina to pick her up and run, surely he could have stood up and escaped when he had been downed earlier.
ああ、あの時は諦めてたから。
His words were unfiltered as ever. Though right then, fighting for their lives, he lacked in some of his usual absent-mindedness.
諦めてたって。
さあ、忘れた。
Though he may have turned away because he regretted saying it aloud, his words spoke volumes. For some reason, it pained Aoko to see him like that.
それより青崎、 唐突に気分が悪いんだが、あの赤い光も。
ええ、魔術の類よ。岩洞打ちって言ってね、北欧の呪詛の一つ。魔術回路のある私には効かないけど。
なんだ、青崎には効かないのか。じゃあ危ないのはあの腕だけだな。
Oko had no idea why he was relieved, but she gritted her teeth and fought down the urge to snap at him. There was no use in yelling at a time like this. Above all, she felt that it would have been petty in the extreme to voice her annoyance right now.
そうね、注意するのは伸ばしてくる腕だけ。大した相手じゃないわ。やっ
This time it was not false bravado. Such an enemy would normally be a breeze for Oko Azaki, but her shameful negligence had led to the disruption of her magic circuits, making her even less formidable than her enemy. At this point, Oko had no way of attacking. The only option left to her was to wait for it to expend all of its magical energy, but its perpetual curse mechanism made that a non-starter. This game of tag would not end until one of them was dead. She realized that she was in the same position she had cornered Tojo in earlier. She glanced at her right arm. She could not imagine how she had gotten into such a mess with her magical energy at more than half of its capacity. This had to be karma for having enjoyed toying with Tojo
た。
earlier.
いるところにはいるものね。
She grumbled under her breath as she shifted her focus. She had the fuel for the fire, but not the igniter, and that kill machine would chase her until the end of time if need be. What she should do next was blindingly clear. She had to get back to normal.
青崎、
ごめん、考え事してた。確か。よし、合ってる。しずきくん、そこに横道あるのわかる？
Oko pointed, but he could see nothing but the walls of the corridor. For one thing, the floor had nothing but left turns, and Oko was pointing to the right.
2階は中心まで行くと1階に降りる階段があるんだけど、それは私が壊したから使えないの。けど、ここの作りも意地が悪くてね。よく見れば、右に曲がる通路もあるのよ。上級者だけにわかる抜け道ってやつ。あとは注意して探せば、1階の階段までショートカットできる。悪いけど、一人で行って。
Oko turned her back to the soldier and started walking in the opposite direction of the escape route and down the long corridor towards the puppets in circle.
あいつは無差別だから、ここで壊さないといけない。魔術師は魔術師同士で争うのはいいんだけど、みだりんの一般人に手を出しちゃいけないって決まりがあるの。あいつの目的は私のわけだし、結果がどうあれ、すっきりするでしょ。
If Oko won, the puppet would be destroyed. If Oko lost, its objective would be complete, and it would shut down. Either way, them going their separate ways would mean Sochu survived. This is what Oko meant. So she explained it as if the events were happening to two totally different people.
運が良ければ入り口までたどり着けるわ。それじゃあ、また明日ね。
また明日。Even Sochu could tell she was just trying to act tough, but she had already disappeared around the corner by the time he fought to stop her. Ich würde dann tatsächlich sagen, dass ich an dem Punkt dann hier die Folge beende. Ich habe beim letzten Mal sowieso ein bisschen überzogen, daher passt das ganz gut. Vielen Dank fürs Zuschauen und bis zum nächsten Mal. Ciao!